Hello everybody. Um, out there in UK Crime Book Club, I'm just about to interview Craig Sisterson, the writer of Southern Cross Crime. Hello, Craig.
G'day. Nice to see you, Alex. Thanks for having me on your show.
No problem at all. Craig has written a compendium on Antipodean crime that involves over 300 authors, so we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there's certainly plenty there, mate. So.
Yeah, one of the key things is to ask you why did you decide to write it, and what made you decide to start when you did why you did.
Well, that's a good question, Alex. As you know, I've been based over here in London for a few years now. I came for family reasons a few years ago and have stayed. And so I go to all these crime fiction festivals, which are wonderful. And I met yourself at Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival a couple of years ago, which was great. And there's a fantastic series here in the UK done by Barry Forshaw. He's done British noir or Brit noir, American noir, Nordic noir, European noir, and Barry's done several other books about Stieg Larsson and Italian film and other things like that. And so, I mean, I think what it came down to is I was reading some of Barry's books. I was talking about crime fiction in general, because quite often I chair events, festival events at various festivals. And sometimes they were Australian and New Zealand authors, and other times they were authors from all over the world, including British and American. And I just kind of started progressively thinking it would be really cool to have a book like Barry's about Australian and New Zealand crime writing, because it's been around for decades. It's been even going back to the 19th century and the late 19th century. Some of the earliest crime writing was actually happening in Australia and New Zealand. But more so recently, there's been a kind of a big surge. I mean, The Dry by Jane Harper, a lot of people will have heard of, but there was a lot of other books that have either been just before that or have followed on from that. And publishers, festivals, readers, librarians, bookshops all seem to be getting more and more interested in Australian and New Zealand crime writing. And I was quite aware of a lot of it, having come from that part of the world, interviewed the authors, reviewed a few hundred Australian and New Zealand crime novels in the last 10 years. And it just seemed like a really good time to maybe add a bit of Antipodean flavour to what is really Barry's excellent series.
Yeah. You run the Naya Marsh Award over in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's correct, Alex.
Yeah. What made you decide to choose Naya to start the award with over other New Zealand authors?
Yeah, well, the idea for the awards kind of kicked in about 2008, 2009. I'd recently returned to New Zealand after having kind of a year traveling around the world, working at summer camps and doing some backpacking and doing some other things. And I'd started reviewing for a number of newspapers and magazines about crime fiction, as well as writing about other things. And it just seemed to me that we had a lot of good New Zealand crime writing, and we didn't have an award. Like in the UK, you've got numerous awards. You've got the CWA Daggers, which are fantastic. You've got the Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Writing Crime Novel of the Year. America had multiple awards. Canada had awards. Australia had the Ned Kelly Awards, and we didn't. So it kind of felt there was a gap because our crime writers wouldn't enter their books in our literary awards, which have had various names. They're currently the Ockham New Zealand Book Awards. They're kind of like the Booker Prize, so you don't really tend to get crime novels entering them. And so it seemed like there was a gap. So we decided to start an awards based on what we'd seen overseas in Canada and Australia and the UK. And we were looking for a name for them. I kind of liked the Canadian ones are called the Arthur Ellis Awards, which is the pseudonym given to the hangman that they used to have in Canada. They would never give their hangman's actual name for executions. They always called him Arthur Ellis. Ned Kelly in Australia is a kind of Robin Hood-like figure, like a legendary bushranger who became a bit of a folk hero, even though he was a criminal, kind of thing. So, and then obviously different names around the world. There was the Agathas named after Agatha Christie as one of the American awards, and the Edgar's named after Edgar Allan Poe. So it just seemed to me we should do something similar to honour the past while celebrating the present and the future of New Zealand crime writing. And Ngaio just seemed the obvious choice. She was one of the queens of crime. Some people don't realise she was a New Zealander because she set the vast majority of her books in Britain and England in particular. And she, her detective was her main detective, Inspector Allen, was a gentleman British detective. She was very much in the ilk of Dorothy Sayers, Marjorie Ellingham, and Agatha Christie, her fellow queens of crime. So not everyone realises she was a New Zealander, but she was. She was born in New Zealand. She lived most of her life in New Zealand, though she spent a good chunk of time in the UK as well. And it just seemed the perfect thing to do to honour her, honour our past while celebrating our present and future as well. Oh, and so I should add that unlike Agatha Christie or Ian Fleming or others, Ngaio didn't have a very big, powerful estate because she died without children and without a lot of relatives. But we did, her closest relative, I think, like a great nephew or something like that. I might not be quite exactly right on that, but I managed to get in touch with him, and he gave us our blessing to use her name and her likeness on the awards, which was really lovely.
You and me have both interviewed Stella Duffy because she has written with Ngaio Marsh on one that was found in the museum somewhere. Money in the Mall.
That's exactly right. And I should just happen to have that book right here for you, Alex, in case you wanted to talk about it. It's called Money in the Morgue. As you can see, it's by Ngaio Marsh and Stella Duffy. It's an excellent book. It was a finalist or a shortlistee for the CWA Historical Dagger last year, and was also shortlisted for our Ngaio Marsh Award, and our judges really loved it as well. Yeah, it's an interesting story behind that, because we've had the likes of Mike Ripley kind of continue on with Marjorie Ellingham's books. We've had more recently Sophie Hannah continue on or bring back Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie. But even dating back a long time before that, obviously, a lot of people don't realise that I think there's been more James Bond books written by people who aren't Ian Fleming than there were written by Ian Fleming, kind of thing. And there's many other authors who've passed away and their characters have been continued. Dame Ngaio was a little trickier because she was a very private person with her private life, and she actually burned or destroyed a lot of her notes and her letters and other things. And the autobiography that she wrote later in life, Black Beach and Honeydew, is good, but you kind of felt that she was still holding some stuff back and she was wanting to keep some things private. There's a very good biography about her called Ngaio, Her Life in Crime, or Ngaio Marsh, Her Life in Crime, by Dr. Joan Drayden, that's more recently come out. And even Joe's said that, she's dug as deep as she could, but the stuff that Ngaio just destroyed, and because she was a very private person. And so there wasn't, with no kind of family legacy, like the Ian Fleming estate or Agatha Christie's grandson is very good at kind of keeping her out there and getting adaptations done and lots of other really good things, which is great for all of us who love Agatha Christie and Ian Fleming. There wasn't as much of a force behind Ngaio Marsh's things, which is a shame because she was an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary woman. But what did happen was many years ago, someone in kind of the National Archives or National Library of New Zealand, a little bit equivalent to the British Library, it's kind of called the Alexander Turnbull Library. It's a little bit like the British Library in many ways. Someone came across, and amongst some other things, there was some handwritten pages, and they realised what they were, and they were the start of a Ngaio Marsh story. And then nothing really happened, and it was just a very interesting thing. And then more recently, a few years ago, they kind of they had those, but they also discovered some handwritten notes on the back of, I think it was an Antony and Cleopatra script. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was an Antony and Cleopatra script, because Dame Ngaio is actually more known in New Zealand in a lot of ways for being a Shakespeare director. She kind of reinvigorated professional theatre in New Zealand. And the reason she's a dame is actually for her work in theatre, as much, if not more, than for her work in crime writing. It's really about her theatre work and and she was just extraordinary in the arts across the board. She was also a painter and other things. And so there was this Antony and Cleopatra script, and she'd handwritten some notes on the back of it. and that plus the other bits that they'd already found, the first kind of 3 or 4 very short chapters. And it was about the right timing with Sophie Hannah bringing Hercule Poirot back, and they share a publisher at HarperCollins, and so there was just an idea of like, maybe now's the right time. And there was the Ngaio Marsh Awards now. There'd been Joe Drayton's biography. There'd been a new little TV show done about Ngaio Marsh. So after being forgotten for a long time in New Zealand, kind of the last 10 years, there's been a lot more about her. And so it just seemed the time was right. And they found the absolute perfect author for it. I was thinking years ago, I had a theoretical discussion with some other reviewers about, you know, if anyone did bring, like, kind of carried on Ngaio Marsh, or who would we get to do it? And in the end, I mean, Stella Duffy's just the perfect person. She's someone who grew up in New Zealand. She understands New Zealand like Ngaio did. But she's also has very strong connections to Britain because she was born here. She moved to New Zealand when she was an infant or a preschooler. And then she's moved back here. And so she's kind of lived half her life in each country, give or take. And like Ngaio, who used to take these very long multi-week ship rides and would actually write some of her crime novels on the ship between Great Britain and New Zealand, kind of back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and stuff, or say 50s and 60s. And Stella's involved in theatre. She's been a theatre director like Ngaio. She's been and she's also just kind of loves the arts in general. She's done a lot of stuff with fun palaces like Ngaio, loved the arts in general. And so there were so many reasons, many more I could list, which made Stella. But Stella's a hell of a writer. She's like written historical fiction and kind of more literary books. She's written some really terrific crime novels back in the 90s, along with Val McDermid and others. She was one of the ones doing kind of the more groundbreaking kind of LGBT plus characters in crime fiction, British crime fiction, with her Saz Martin series. And so, yeah, they kind of went to Stella, and it's worked out really great. It's a great book. It really is. I know some people push back on those continuation novels, but this is a really good example of how it can be done really well. So.
In your book, you also mentioned how an author used Ngaio as a character in one of his novels.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah. That created a little bit of a stir at the time. As a kind of New Zealand, kind of more of a literary or historical author called Stephen Eldred Grigg, who was one of those authors that I was, and I don't mean this in a mean way to Stephen, because he's a very good writer. He's a very quality writer. But as a kind of 14, 15, 16-year-old kid in New Zealand growing up, I was kind of forced to read some of his kind of literary, historical, colonial New Zealand type books. And so he's kind of known for some very good books like that, but as a teenager, they're not really the kind of things you want to be forced to read in English at school. And I discovered years later that he'd also written this kind of satirical mystery. And so he was and Stephen's very sharp, and he's always very incisive in his books. He doesn't suffer fools, and he'll like prod at famous historical figures, and he kind of has written some kind of edgy stuff about times that we don't necessarily think of as being that edgy and things. He's a very good author, but he wrote this book that got a really mixed reception because although Ngaio had been somewhat forgotten by New Zealand as a whole, she was still very beloved in certain circles that remembered her, particularly in the theatre and arts community, but also the writing community, and particularly in Canterbury and Christchurch. So some of those people weren't happy with Stephen's book because he actually kind of made her a bit of a parody figure, or a satirical figure. It's a book called Blue Bloods by Stephen Eldred Grigg. But then other people were like, no, would probably love it. And some of the people that were closest to her that I actually saw comment on it said, you know, she would probably love this because she liked genre fiction, she liked popular fiction, she didn't suffer fools. She had her airs and graces, but she was also very down to earth. And so some people think that she actually would have really loved the book, even though it was a slight mistake of the mystery genre and a slight mistake of her herself. So.
What would you say is your favorite comedy mystery drama that you talked about in the
favorite comedy mystery drama? Are we talking books or television? So
both.
Trying to think. I mean, New Zealand and Australian crime writing has a good sense of humour running through it in general. So even the kind of darker books have a very gallows sense of humour, and then some of them, a little bit like Val McDermid and Mark Billingham and some others, kind of have some nice gallows humour. Stuart McBride's very good like that. You wouldn't say that his books are comedy crime, but you still kind of laugh in amongst the nastiness in Stuart McBride novels. So there's a few New Zealanders like that, like Paul Cleave's very good at that. He writes some very dark crime, but also has some very good black humour and gallows humour. Van der Simon has a good just kind of Kiwi gal, Sam Shepard, at the heart of her series, and there's a good sense of humour running through that. But they're more traditional police procedural crime novels and stuff. You wouldn't say that they're not comic crime novels like you think of, like Carl Hiaasen or early Chris Brookmeyer, or there's some other authors like that. I'm trying to think of like laugh out loud funny novels. There's an Australian one called A Man You Can Bank On, and yeah, that's really cool. That's about it's set kind of in outback Australia. It was written 8 to 10 years ago, so a little bit before kind of Australia and New Zealand stuff was getting well known over here, and that's kind of a funny novel. Like it's kind of a Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels or Snatch set in outback Australia, where you're kind of laughing even though there's a little bit of violence and a little bit of kind of over the top crazy characters and stuff like that. So that's a really good one. It's got by a guy called Derek Hansen. I'm trying to think of other ones off the top of my head. As you say, there's 300 authors in the book. So, trying to remember which was the funniest ones. But that would be a good one to dig out. I'm not sure how available it is over here. There's another book I really loved recently. Is not laugh out loud funny, but is very exuberant and charming. So it's kind of a different feel to a lot of crime fiction, and that's called The Nancys by R.W. MacDonald. And he's a Melbourne-based author, Melbourne, Australia, but he grew up in New Zealand. So he's actually set the book in the bottom of the South Island, New Zealand, in a small town. And that's about a little girl who's kind of an adolescent girl, and her father's recently passed away, and her mum's under a lot of stress, and she gets to go away on holiday because her gay uncle from Sydney comes back to look after her, and he's like a big Santa Claus looking bloke. Not that I can really talk at the moment, kind of thing. And he brings his very kind of fashionista boyfriend back from Sydney, and he's trying to look after this girl who's going through grief and adolescence and everything else. And they form a little club, Loving Nancy Drew Mysteries, and then a death happens in the town, and they decide to try and solve it. And it's kind of it's not comic crime where it's written to be funny, but it's beautifully charming and exuberant, and there's a lot of kind of it's a kind of book that makes you smile, and you don't necessarily say that about crime fiction all the time. Crime fiction makes you think, and it makes you thrilled, and it kind of keeps you turning the pages. But it was a book that I kind of closed and just had a big smile on my face reading through the whole way through it. So it doesn't exactly answer your question, Alex, but I hope that helps.
What would you say makes a book quintessentially Antipodean?
That's a very good question. I mean, I don't want to pigeonhole anyone or anything, because it's like if I said what makes a crime novel quintessentially British, there's a lot of different crime fiction in Britain. What makes a crime novel quintessentially American? We can draw sweeping generalizations, but there's so much variety, and that's, I think, one of the things that I hope Southern Cross Crime shows, is that we have some outstanding kind of outback Australia fiction with the likes of Jane Harper, and Chris Hammer is another one who won the CWA Dagger last year for Scrublands. That's an outstanding book. And there's some other like brilliant small town Australian crime writing, Gary Disher and Aoife Clifford, and many others. But there's a lot of variety beyond that. So I'm a little hesitant to say quintessential, because it implies that they're all alike, and they're not. It's like Scandinavian crime fiction. They're not all kind of dour, alcoholic, maverick loner police detectives in a cold environment. There's a lot of other variety there as well if you look beyond that. But I think one of the things that is probably typically in New Zealand and Australian crime fiction is a really strong sense of place. Even in the cities, nature is so close to us. In New Zealand and Australia, we have so much more nature and so much more wilderness. New Zealand's actually bigger than Great Britain. A lot of people don't realise, but it's kind of got Scotland's population spread over a land that's bigger than Great Britain. So we've got a lot of wilderness, a lot of countryside. It's right there, even in our biggest city in Auckland, which is over 1.5 million people. So it's actually bigger than most of the cities in the UK outside of London and a couple of others. There's nature, the beaches are right there on the doorstep. There's state forest parks right there on the verge of the city. And so we're kind of enclosed by nature, whether it's the outback, whether it's snow-capped mountains and kind of alpine forests and alpine lakes. It's very, very close to us. So even if you grow up in a suburb or even if you grow up in a city, you kind of have that connection to land and nature a bit more so in New Zealand and Australia, just intrinsically in you, even if you're not super outdoorsy or anything. It's just kind of part of life because it's right there all the time. So even the most city kids have probably been camping and they go to the beach regularly and they they can go to the forest because it's right there, and they probably went camping to the batch with their parents when they were little. So there's a sense of nature, and our nature is very different to the English countryside. It's more menacing, for want of a better phrase. In Australia, you've got a lot of animals that can kill you. With snakes and deadly spiders and saltwater crocodiles and sharks off the coast and some other things. And you've got the weather can kill you with the heat and stuff like that and the desert. In New Zealand, we don't have the dangerous kind of animals, but our weather, if anything, is almost worse than Australia's in terms of storms and rain and snowfall up in the mountains and hiking, rivers flooding. When I grew up, there was an ad in New Zealand that actually had a picture of an Australian river with a crocodile and a picture of a New Zealand river, which looks beautiful, like something out of the Lord of the Rings. And then it's like, which one's more dangerous? And it's actually the New Zealand one. More people die because of accidents and the weather changing and the rivers surging and things like that. So sorry to go on, Alex, but I'm just trying to kind of make clear that it's kind of nature, but also the nature of the nature, for want of a better phrase. It's like it's more menacing. And so that comes through in a lot of New Zealand crime, even if it's city-based. And then there's a kind of a Kiwi-Australian sense of humour and an Antipodean sense of humour, which is probably, our Scottish and Irish friends would probably kind of relate to that as well, in particular, and kind of that kind of cultural thing, being a slightly smaller country population-wise or kind of more sparsely populated. So those are some of the things that I think we bring. And we also, New Zealanders are quite outward looking because we're a small country at the bottom of the world, small in population. So we're used to US culture coming in on our TV screens and British culture coming in on our TV screens. And so we had our own stuff plus all that. Whereas growing up, I can't imagine you had a lot of Australian and New Zealand shows on the TV outside of maybe Neighbours and Home and Away, and occasionally now the Brokenwood Mysteries or Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, which are great shows. I think that affects our view on the world. A lot of New Zealanders and Australians travel, so we look kind of outward and we're kind of aware of things going on. So that just gives our characters and the things in our stories a different perspective as well. And we've also got very strong Indigenous populations in different ways. Australia has one of the oldest Indigenous cultures in the world that goes back tens of thousands of years with the Aboriginal people. Although their numbers are not very high anymore in terms of percentage of the population, they're still a strong culture and they still play a part in everyday Australian life. And the Maori culture in New Zealand, about 15% of our population is Maori or Maori descent, and so even if you're kind of don't consider yourself part of that culture, it's still part of the country that you grew up in. So I think all those things kind of in a bit of a kaleidoscope and a bit of a mix just give us a little bit of a different spice, a little bit of a different seasoning on kind of the crime fiction traditions from Britain or America.
Speaking of traditions from all over the world, I just read Nowhere Child, which is based in Melbourne and America. What books in the collection do you think reflect two countries as well as that one?
Well, there's an entire section in Southern Cross Crime called Home and Away, and that's about books that are not set in New Zealand and Australia, but are by New Zealand and Australian authors or authors with New Zealand and Australian connections. We've seen that most recently, actually, not to digress too much, Alex, but with the Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Novel of the Year shortlist that was just announced last week. 6 wonderful books, really good. I've read all 6 of those authors. They're all terrific. And 3 of them are linked to Australia, which doesn't usually happen with Theakston because it's a British and Irish crime writing award. But we've got one Northern Irish Australian, Adrian McGinty, and 2 kind of British Australians as well, in terms of I'm sorry, I just wasn't sure if Adrian wanted to be called British or not since he's from Northern Ireland. So because Jane Harper was born in England, but then she lives in Australia now, and she grew up some there when she was a kid as well. And she's kind of bounced back, but now she lives in Australia and has done all her writing there and was a journalist there and stuff. So that was The Lost Man, which is a tremendous novel. And Adrian's The Chains actually set in the United States, where he's just moved to recently. He did live in Melbourne for I think over 10 years and wrote a lot of his Sean Duffy series set during the Troubles from Melbourne, and having that distance from Northern Ireland to be able to kind of write it with that kind of insider outsider perspective. And The Chain, which is the book that's been a huge breakthrough for him, fantastic thriller. He also wrote from kind of a house in Melbourne and kind of suburban Melbourne. And then Helen Fitzgerald's Worst Case Scenario, which is one of my favourite reads from last year as well, along with the other 2. Helen's lived in Glasgow for a large number of years, most of her adult life, after coming over here as a student, after growing up in small town Australia. So all 3 of those authors, plus many others, kind of have that multicultural, for want of a better sense, kind of Antipodean and Northern Hemisphere British kind of balance going on. And the section in Southern Cross Crime called Home and Away deals with books like Helen and Adrian's, which are set overseas. And we also, like Helen, we have a number of New Zealand and Australian authors. I mean, Stella herself's a New Zealander who lives in London, like me, and there's others like Adam Christopher up in Manchester. He's a New Zealander based in the UK, and he writes kind of some really interesting books that are kind of 1950s, 60s LA noir with a bit of a science fiction twist. He was a finalist for our Noah Marshall Awards a few years ago. He's also written some novels related to Elementary, the American television series about Sherlock Holmes with Lucy Liu as Dr. Watson. He's written some kind of TV tie-in books about that as well. So that whole section has a number of authors, a couple of 3 dozen examples. Ben Sanders, an Auckland writer, had a very good series set in Auckland. He got picked up by a big American publisher because of it, and so his last 3 books have been set in the States, both down in New Mexico and in New York, but he still lives in New Zealand. I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, Alex, but you kind of have those cross-cultural kind of things going on there. There aren't necessarily so many books that jump around or in both places like Christians, but there are a lot of authors that kind of have that insider-outsider perspective, either living in Australia and New Zealand and setting their books overseas, or being an Australian and New Zealander living overseas wherever they set their books. I'm trying to think of some others like Christians, which are both off the top of my head. I'm struggling a little, but there probably are some.
I was thinking about Theakston's when you mentioned it. When you were asked to do the panel, what made you just decide on what you might ask there that you haven't asked in other places when you've been?
Are you talking about the panel we did at Harrogate last
Yeah,
year?
yeah.
Okay. It was Murray Howner and the Harrogate team that put that panel together. Murray didn't ask me to choose who would be on it. She chose herself. I was delighted with who she chose, with Van der Simon, Stella Duffy, Jane Harper, and Christian White, because they're all excellent authors and they all write some kind of different things to each other. So it's that example of the diversity of Australian and New Zealand crime. But in terms of what we talked about there, I tend to just get up on stage and have a conversation, whether it's a one-on-one like I did with Val McDermott at Edinburgh last year, or kind of two-on-one with Chris Brookmeyer and Michael Rebotham, who's Australian, at Bloody Scotland last year, and that was a panel of 5. So I just tend to have ideas in my head of what we talk about, but let the people let the kind of the guests and the authors, because it's really about them. And so I just recently listened back to that because they put it up on Harrogate International Festival's player, the HIF player. So you can actually listen to it now if you missed it at the time because it was sold out. And it's a really fun discussion. We talked about some of these things. We talked about setting and the sense of humour and the kind of inside or outsider perspective of the authors who are kind of part of both kind of northern and southern hemisphere, either with where they're setting their books or where they've lived their lives. And we talked about, some of the Stella shared some stuff about doing the Dame Naya book. And Vanda's had an interesting career because she put out 5 really excellent books, kind of between 7 and 12 years ago. And it was like shortlisted for awards, was local bestseller, published by a big publisher in New Zealand, but was never really published elsewhere around the world, even though she was with a big multinational publisher. And then while she took some time off from crime writing to do a PhD, which was a PhD in kind of the communication of science and crime fiction, not just forensics, but communication of science more generally. There was a little bit about kind of poisons used by Naya Marsh, but there was a lot of other stuff about science and communication in crime fiction. While that was going on, her books were kind of picked up by Karen Sullivan and Arenda Books here in the UK. So she's kind of been launched over here a few years later and was shortlisted for the debut, the John Creasy New Blood Dagger last year, which is interesting because she kind of wrote that debut like 10, 12 years, 15 years ago. But she's kind of a new author for UK readers and American readers. And so that's fantastic to see that more and more New Zealand and Australian authors who've kind of been great for a little while are becoming more available, as well as the brand new kind of Australian and New Zealand writers. If you don't mind, Alex, I'm just noticing on the side here, there's some questions kind of popping up from people that are watching.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So we've got something about does Southern Cross Crime include some of the amazing indie published Australian and New Zealand authors? Yes, it does. It does. I mean, even though it has not quite it's got over 300 authors, TV shows, and films. It's about 260, 270 authors, and there's about 60, 70 TV shows and films. And plus there's others listed, but in terms of ones that it actually kind of covers and features and has a paragraph or two about, there's about 260, 270. And that was still cut down. You think, oh, that's a lot. But there was a lot of other authors I could have put in there. So we had to make choices. And so, but there is a large amount of indie published authors. Some of them hopefully will be available over here in a variety of ways, whether it's ebook or via various kind of online and other book retailers where you can get hold of their books, whether it's the print copies or ebook copies, definitely. And so, yeah, there's a fair few. I'm very much for. Like in our Naya Marsh Awards, we've actually had one author, Finn Bell, who's actually from Dunedin, the same as Van der Simon and Liam McIlvany. Finn Bell has won a Naya Marsh Award for Best First Novel, was a finalist for Best Novel with his second book, and he's won 2 American indie publishing awards, and he just self-publishes ebooks. I mean, he gets professional editors and cover design and all that kind of thing. but he's not yet published by a traditional publisher. Someone might pick him up at some stage, which would be great, in terms of just broadening the audience. But he sold tens and tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 plus copies, won multiple awards in the US and New Zealand, and his are only currently available in ebook. They're not even available in indie published paperback or anything. So he was welcome as part of our Ngaio Marsh Awards. We welcome indie published authors and ebook authors to our Ngaio Marsh Awards, as well as traditionally published. So I kind of carried on the same thing with the book itself. And so there's a good smattering of indie published authors in Southern Cross Crime.
I was interested to see the final section had a group of interviews in it. What made you select those for the final section? Because you must have done loads in your past.
It was a mix of looking back at the interviews I'd already done. I've been very lucky. I was just basically this book-loving Kiwi guy who had been a lawyer and was writing for a legal magazine. And I kind of fell into doing crime fiction reviews. There's a bit of a story in the author's introduction at the start of the book about that. But basically, by accident, I ended up becoming a crime fiction reviewer, basically to fill some pages when someone else didn't get content in. My editor asked me if I'd read anything lately, and I loved crime fiction. I'd read some crime fiction, so I reviewed that for a legal magazine, going to all the judges and lawyers and attorney generals and politicians involved in the law in New Zealand. And there was a good response to it, and so we started doing that every now and again, doing fiction reviews as well as legal and other books. And from there, I kind of just started writing about crime fiction for a lot of other newspapers and magazines, the biggest newspapers in New Zealand and magazines in Australia and America and elsewhere. And it's just kind of, it was funny how it worked like that. Sorry, I've lost track of sorry, Alex. I've lost track a little bit of where that original question was. Sorry, I was looking at a question from someone else at the same time.
If you want to answer the question for somebody else, if you got that in your head, go for it.
No, that's cool. What can you just bring me back, kind of circle me back to what we were talking about?
I was asking about the interviews at the end and why you chose those.
Yeah, sorry. So along with reviewing, I started doing author profiles for like you see in the Guardian or the Telegraph or the Times or other newspapers, and they have their Saturday or Sunday editions where there's quite often like the glossy magazine that's inside, and they have, arts and entertainment, and, there's kind of a page or two big interviews with people. And I started doing that about authors. I did do that kind of writing about sports people and other figures as well, and other kind of features. But I started doing more and more about authors. And so I tallied it up once a while ago, like a year or two ago, and it was over 200 authors I've interviewed, either for newspapers or magazines or on stage at festivals and some other kind of online kind of interviews I've done as well, and amongst all that. So it was well over 200 authors, of which a few dozen were Australian and New Zealand, because I'd always tried to include them because I knew they didn't always get included. So I was fortunate enough to have interviewed a number of leading Australian and New Zealand crime writers, some for magazines and newspapers. So the book actually includes some of my old magazine and newspaper features if I felt that they were still interesting for people to read or relevant. Like one of the reasons I did that was two of the groundbreaking Australian authors of the modern era are Peter Corris and Peter Temple. Peter Temple, some British crime fiction fans may have heard of because he won the Gold Dagger. I'm trying to think now, it'd be more than around 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago. He won the Gold Dagger for a book called The Broken Shore. And his later book, Truth, also won the Miles Franklin, which is kind of the Australian equivalent to the Booker Prize. So it created a big stir when a crime novel won, effectively a crime novel winning the Booker Prize, kind of thing. And so some British readers and some people watching this may have heard of Peter Temple because he was published over here, won the Gold Dagger, and kind of he's one of those people like Adrian McGinty and Paul Cleave and others who's an outstanding author, and they're loved by awards judges and loved by critics. They're not necessarily stacked 50 books at the front of the Waterstones, kind of thing, but when you talk to people, they love their stuff. And so, and the other one was Peter Corris, who was kind of the first Australian to do an Australian private eye series, kind of an American-style Australian private eye series, back in 1980. So we're talking 40 years ago now, and the world was a very different place then. And Australian authors and New Zealand authors, and even up to a few years ago, this was still happening, where they were kind of encouraged to set their books in the UK or the US, not Australia or New Zealand, because they were worried that local readers wouldn't read them, let alone the international readers. And so Peter Corris decided anyway, and he got some rejections from publishers, but then started, and he ended up writing a book series that's over 50 books about a guy called Cliff Hardy. And I was fortunate enough to interview Peter for one of my first articles for an Australian magazine. And I had a really nice conversation with Peter for over an hour. A lovely man. And he sadly passed away, and so did Peter Temple, kind of in the early days of me starting to think about writing this book. And but because I had that published feature on Peter, I talked to the magazine editor, and they were cool with me republishing it in the book. And unfortunately, I hadn't managed to interview Peter Temple before he passed away. But thanks to Michael Rebotham, who's an author that many people in UK Crime Book Club will have read and will have loved. He's a fantastic writer. He shared with me a lot of his thoughts on Peter Temple, plus I got some from other people, and kind of created a chapter on Peter Temple about that. So, sorry, in a kind of circular way, that was one of the reasons why I decided to kind of not just do brand new interviews, because I wanted to be able to include those on the two Peters. And then I had some other really cool interviews where I'd talk to people at a particular time with their books. And if you talk to them now when their career changed, it would be a different kind of story. So it's kind of nice to have those tent posts of, like, you know, Liam McElveen talking before The Quaker came out, which won a lot of awards and stuff like that, and when he was kind of starting out as a crime writer, or Jane Harper talking about her second book rather than talking about The Dry, which was amazing, or talking about The Lost Man, which has come out and been shortlisted for the Theakston Award, as well as many other awards, and won several awards in Australia as well. So I kind of liked having that historic time and place. And then I did some brand new interviews with several people, including Gary Disher, Candice Fox, who many people might know because she co-writes some books with James Patterson, though she's won a number of awards for her standalone books and her series books that she writes by herself. She's an outstanding writer. And Lindy Cameron, who's the head of Sisters in Crime Australia, the president. So there's a mix of old and new, and yeah, that's kind of how that came about as well, Alex. It's often a little bit of kind of very organic evolution kind of thing. So.
Yeah. In the book, you included TV. What made you decide to include that as part of the mix as well?
Well, probably the shortest or easiest answer is because Barry included it in his, and I wanted my book to be akin to Barry's, so it could sit on the shelf beside him. And he included TV in several of his books. I mean, having said that, I did things differently because I included these long interviews, and I included children's and YA books, which Barry doesn't include. So I have done things a little bit differently myself. But a part of it was because Barry did, so I thought that would be good. And part of it was that there's some fantastic Australian and New Zealand crime dramas, both television and film, and more viewers all around the world, like readers all around the world, can get their hands on Australian and New Zealand crime fiction more easily nowadays, both because it's published by American and British publishers, but also because of the internet and ebooks and other things. It's just, you know, it's easier to find and it's easier to get your hands on than it used to be, as well as having it in your bookstores and your libraries now. And it's a little bit the same with film and television. So, you know, the BBC screens Mystery Road. It's outstanding kind of crime drama series set in outback Australia. The Brokenwood Mysteries is on the Drama Channel, which is free in the UK, and you can watch the entire 6 series for free on UK TV Play, on, you know, kind of thing. And that's a really cool small town New Zealand crime drama. Top of the Lake by Jane Campion, Underbelly, and there's many others as well, and along with films like Animal Kingdom and other films like that. I mean, there's New Zealand influence in other shows you don't even know about. I mean, Luther, the British crime drama, is written by a New Zealand-based author, Neil Cross. He's British, but he's lived in New Zealand for I think 15 plus years, and he conceived of, wrote, and worked on Luther from his home in suburban Wellington, kind of thing. And there's a few American TV dramas that have Australian and New Zealand links, but for the TV and film section, I did focus solely on crime dramas that are set in New Zealand and Australia. So I mentioned Luther in passing, but I don't kind of profile it as such. So, but yeah, that was basically why. One, because Barry did it, and two, because there's a lot of great stuff, and particularly with streaming nowadays. I mean, I was watching. I wanted to revisit some shows when I was writing about them, not just write about them from memory. And I could find dozens of Australian and New Zealand crime dramas available on BBC iPlayer, UK TV Play, Acorn TV. I have Amazon Prime because I really love the Bosch series by Michael Connolly, so I've got Amazon Prime. And there's several like random Australian crime dramas that I wouldn't have thought would have been on Prime that are on there, like City Homicide and Blue Heelers and other shows like that were around, 10, 15 years ago. And I remember watching when I was kind of younger in New Zealand and Australia. But anyone can watch them now on Prime or Netflix or things like that. So it just seemed, again, kind of everything all together kind of seemed to be wise to include film and television. So.
What was the biggest non-New Zealand import that you watched as you were growing up that influenced you in crime and things?
Oh, okay. That's a great question. So film or television, we're talking about, not books. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Because for books, it was Hardy Boys and Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes, and then it went on to James Patterson and Patricia Cornwell when I was an adolescent, and Alistair MacLean, and then into all sorts of other authors. In terms of television, my favourite show growing up was a show called MacGyver, which I thought was big all around the world, and it was one of those classic 80s shows, but I don't know how big it was in Britain, because I was chatting to some British friends about it recently and they hadn't heard of it. And he wasn't, it's not so much a crime drama, but it was a lot of mystery. He was often kind of solving problems and helping people, and was kind of like a scientist / semi-secret agent who didn't use a gun. And there was some definitely crime. A lot of the topics were crime and social justice, and he would kind of go around and help people, a little bit like the roving cowboy of old who went from town to town and helped people. So that wasn't really crime drama, but I think that fed my love of kind of thrills and mystery. There were a couple of I was a bit too young to kind of get the A-Team and Miami Vice and things like that, though I saw them years later in reruns. But there was a show called Chips, which I really liked, which was about police officers in Los Angeles, motorcycle police officers. Again, I was a bit young when it was out, it was out before my time, but I kind of caught reruns in New Zealand when I was growing up. Yeah, so it was shows like that early on. One I really loved that I actually revisited during lockdown, because I think a lot of us, Alex, have been like finding, we've been binging series that perhaps we haven't got to, or revisiting favorite series where we saw a lot of episodes but never saw them all. I saw Liz Barnsley the other day just binged through all of The West Wing, which is an outstanding show. Not a crime drama, a kind of political, social drama, but outstanding. And so early on in lockdown, I actually found myself searching out, there's a show called Due South, and it's kind of a Canadian-American show, and it's about a Mountie who ends up in Chicago. So like a Mountie from Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the full kind of red and the hat and everything. And he ends up in Chicago, and he ends up kind of teaming up with a kind of grungy Chicago street cop, and they end up solving crimes together. And I loved that show growing up. So that was probably one of the first crime shows I really loved. Yeah, he was the Mountie was a bit of a Boy Scout, and the the Chicago cop's a little bit of a kind of streetwise Chicago cop. So it was a bit of the kind of fish out of water, plus the buddy cop thing, plus kind of a bit of lighthearted crime and mystery. It wasn't too violent, though. There was violence and there was some kind of humor through it. So I loved that as a kid. Yeah. Sorry, Alex, I'm going to talk to myself around. And I think if I'm...
all right, no problem.
Yeah, so that was probably one. And so I revisited that because the Canadian TV commission put a whole lot of it on YouTube a couple of years ago. So some of it's available just to watch for free on there. So I ended up binging about 10 episodes of it early in lockdown, and it's still fun to watch. So.
I was just contemplating while you were saying that about the Maori characters that you covered in the book, because I haven't read any yet, and I was tempted to try and have a look at reading one.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a big discussion in crime fiction recently. It's kind of been lost a little with everything else going on in the world and the pandemic, and with the Black Lives Matter protests, most of them largely peaceful, that are going on all around the world. And a little bit within that, over the last few years, there's been a bit of a push, particularly in America and a little bit in Great Britain as well, about diversity in crime fiction. Because, like every other area of publishing, we're more predominantly white or Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon, whatever you want to call it. We're more predominantly white and middle and upper class than kind of general population demographics would or should be. And so I think we're crying out for more diverse voices, because it only elevates things. It only makes things better. The more fresh voices we get in, the more crime writers of color, whether they're Black British or African American or British Asians or Maori and Aboriginal authors in New Zealand. So I'm very pleased that I have been able to include some in the book. There's people like J.P. Murray, who won our Best First Novel Award at the NIOs last year. His book, Call Me Evie. It's a psychological thriller, so it doesn't have a Maori detective as such, though it has Indigenous characters, and he's a Maori author. Philip McLaren, who I included in the book, kind of broke the colour barrier, so to speak, in Australia back in the 90s. There had been white Australian and white New Zealand authors who'd written Maori and Aboriginal characters, including main characters, in the past. Most famously, Arthur Upfield's Boney series, Napoleon Boney Bonaparte, who's a half Aboriginal tracker. And he wrote that in like the 1920s, 30s through to the 50s, 60s. And he even was like shortlisted for an Edgar and stuff. It was made into TV shows. So some people are kind of familiar with that or were aware of it. But he was actually kind of a white Australian. I think he might have been born in the UK, but lived most of his life in Australia. Author. So it's good to get people writing kind of their own stories in a diverse array of voices. I'd like to see a lot more of it. I'm glad there was some to include in the book. I'm glad that I can shine a light on some authors that, like Nicole Watson, who's written a really tremendous book about kind of Aboriginal land rights. It's kind of a crime novel entwined with very real life things about Aboriginal land rights in Queensland. And that won some awards, and people over here wouldn't necessarily have heard of that. So I'm really glad that I could kind of shine a light on some books like that, among others. But yeah, it would be great to have more. It would be great to have more. I think that's the same in the US and the UK. It's brilliant seeing like Abir Mukherjee and Vaseem Khan and many others kind of come through. A.A. Dand, Drita Say Mitchell, fantastic. And then in the States, two of my favorite books in the last year, Heaven My Home by Attica Locke, who's an African American author, and it's just a brilliant, searing crime novel. It's a fantastic crime novel, but it's got a lot of stuff about social justice and race relations in it, just as texture and background. It doesn't bang you over the head with it. It just is, and it's a great crime novel. And another book called Your House Will Pay by Steph Cha, who's a kind of Korean American author, and she writes about the clash between the Korean and Black communities, which is often forgotten about. We often think of it as a black-white thing in America, but it's and that's a brilliant book. I mean, for my money, those two books should be on every award shortlist in the world this year, and they're on some, and they've won some. But I'm always curious when they don't appear. Kind of thing, because they're fantastic. So.
Yeah. We're going to go to a few more audience questions, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah, sure. What do we have here? We answered that one. So we've got indie published authors. I would like some New Zealand crime writer recommendations. Okay, sure. Yeah, I can help with that. There's about 80 to 100 New Zealand authors in the book, so you can find some there. In terms of ones that you can most easily get your hands on in the UK, where you might be able to walk into your local indie bookshop or your Waterstones, and it might be on the shelf, and or they could very easily get it in because it's published by a UK publisher, so they can just get it from London. They don't have to get it from Australia and New Zealand. So I'm going to give you some of those ones. There are lots of others, lots of indie published authors, other ones that are worth seeking out. But just in terms of kind of most easily answering the question of like great authors that are easy for you in the UK Crime Book Club to get your hands on. I mean, we already talked about Money in the Moor by Ngaio Marsh and Stella Duffy. That's fantastic. And that's set in New Zealand. Dame Ngaio Marsh set 4 of her 32 Inspector Allen novels in New Zealand. A lot of people don't realise that, but 4 of them actually are set in New Zealand. Died in the Wool, Artists in Crime, and a couple of others. And so they're worth digging out. And Stella's one was set in New Zealand. Okay, I had a little, because I've just been rearranging my bookshelf, so I've got over 200 New Zealand crime novels in my house here in London, and I've got another couple of 300 back in New Zealand in storage with some friends. That's not in counting probably over 100 to 200 on ebook. This book I love. This won our Ngaio Marsh Award a couple of years ago, and it's actually published by a British publisher. So you can get it for like your normal paperback prices of like £7 or £8 or £9. You don't have to pay import prices. It's called The Last Time We Spoke by Fiona Sussman, and it's really brilliant. It's a book that's kind of about crime, more than being a crime novel as such. There's no investigation. Basically, there's a very bad crime happens at the start of the book, and then the story focuses on one of the surviving victims and one of the people who was involved as a perpetrator, and it follows their lives over the next little while. And it's a really fascinating book. It's kind of a slightly more literary, but not like it's very accessible. Great read, great writing, and it raises some big issues. Fiona's actually South African, but she's lived in New Zealand for a long time. She grew up in apartheid South Africa, and she ended up coming to New Zealand when she was young and doing a medical degree and stuff. So she's kind of looking at New Zealand from that insider-outsider perspective, and there's a lot about race relations and kind of crime statistics and things like that in here. So that's really interesting. The Last Time We Spoke by Fiona Sussman. I've already mentioned her, but well worth digging out. She has 3 books out now, and a 4th one is coming out soon, and a 5th and a 6th soon after that. So it is Van Simon's Sam Shepard series. So we have Overkill, which was a CWA Dagger shortlisty last year, and then The Ringmaster and Containment. And thanks to Arenda Books, they're all available here, all at really kind of like good UK prices. So you can get them for less than £10, and the ebooks for even less, often online. So that's great. So they're really accessible. One of my favorite crime series is just this kind of it's a word we say in New Zealand is spunky. It's kind of it's not quite feisty. Feisty is not always a good word, but it's kind of like a young female detective who's got a lot of attitude, and she stands up for herself in the boys' club, but she still doubts herself and stuff. But she's not like deeply troubled or addicted like some of those maverick police officers. Sorry, we might be interrupted by a 5-year-old in a second. Okay. Can you do it quietly, please, Maddie? Thank you. She's watching a movie. Paul Cleave is outstanding. You don't need to hear me say it. Mark Billingham, Simon Kernick, Ian Rankin, Val McDermott, and others all rave about Paul Cleave. He is brilliant. He should be so much huger than he is over here. Kind of he's the New Zealand Adrian McGinty, where he's an author that everyone who read loved for years. Critics, awards judges, and everyone's like, why isn't he bigger? Why isn't he bigger? He sells hundreds of thousands of copies in France and Germany, but for a number of reasons, his books weren't always available in the UK, but you can get them now. This one is a brilliant standalone, Trust No One, won some awards. He's also got some series books about a private investigator, cop private investigator. He kind of bounces in and out of the cop world like Harry Bosch does in LA a little bit, where sometimes he's a cop and sometimes he's outside, called Theo Tate. They're brilliant. I really like this one. It just came out in the UK. Sound of Her Voice by Nathan Blackwell. It's a very dark police procedural, so I know a lot of people in the group love like M.W. Craven and people like that. Chris Carter. I know a lot of people in UK Crime Book Club love those. So if you like them, then Paul Cleave and Nathan Blackwell might be right up your alley. They're kind of darker police procedurals and crime novels. Some gallows humour, some dark deeds. The thing about The Sound of Her Voice, and I think, the Mail on Sunday listed it as one of their best thrillers of last year, even though it came out right before Christmas, right at the end of the year, so it got lost a little bit. But it follows this cop over his career for a number of years. It's not just a one case or 1 week kind of thing. So it's a different kind of police procedural. But pretty much everyone that I gave that book to has come back really loving it. A lot of authors have raved about it. And so, yeah, dig that one out if you can. The Sound of a Voice by Nathan Blackwell. Paul Cleave, always good. He's got 11 books, all worth getting. I've read them all, and they're all great. Van der Simon's got 3 books out, and 4th on the way soon. Last time we spoke, Money in the Morgue, and there's a lot of others, but hopefully that's enough. I don't want to overdo everyone. And if you want more, then read Southern Cross Crime. There's like another 80, 90 New Zealand authors in it, plus another 150 Australians. So.
If you were to recommend any of the UA writers,
the young adult ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, going back to what we talked about before. Sorry, my hair's annoying me a little bit. It was already a bit long at the start of lockdown, and now it's really long. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah, actually, there's a really cool book, going back to what we talked about Indigenous authors just before, because one of the Indigenous author books that I highlight in Southern Cross Crime, and a book that I've recommended to British readers in the past when I've done a little kind of like 15 authors to try kind of lists, is called Catching Teller Crow. I don't have a paperback copy of it here, sorry, so I can't show it to you. It's called Catching Teller Crow, Teller, T-E-L-L-E-R, Crow, by Amberlyn and Ezekiel Quay Molina. And they're a brother and sister duo. And Amberlyn's written some other books before. I think this might be Ezekiel's first one. And it's a kind of YA mystery thriller that's kind of entwined with some Aboriginal things going on. It's kind of small town, and this father who deals with tragedy and then has got to kind of deal with some crime stuff going on. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's that's well worth digging out. And there's some, I was really pleased to include YA and middle grade, I think they often call them here in the States, kind of the younger reader books, because that's what I grew up on. It was Hardy Boys and Agaton Sax by Nils Olof Franzen, who was a Swedish author. The kind of books for kind of, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old keen readers and stuff. The equivalent of Nancy Drew. I read some Nancy Drew. I kind of read more Hardy Boys, being a boy growing up. Nancy Drew was cool too. And I love those books, and those are the books that really got me into mystery. Your question about what got me in earlier about TV, it was really those books. It was Hardy Boys and others that got me into it, more so than television. And so I wanted to kind of showcase the authors that are doing it now. I mean, there's a fantastic British author called Robin Stevens, whose books I really love. I've got 2 or 3 already. You can't read them yet herself, but they're there for me to read to her soon, and for her to read herself when she's a bit older. And they're kind of historical ones set back in early 20th century Britain, with kind of a couple of adolescent heroines who solve crimes. It's kind of a little bit like Nancy Drew, but set in kind of historical England. And they're fantastic. And so I wanted to showcase the New Zealand and Australian authors that are doing the same. So definitely check out Catching Teller Crow. That's a one-off. But there are a number of other New Zealand and Australian authors. There's a whole section on it in Southern Cross Crime.
Have you got a favourite subgenre of crime?
What's that, sorry?
Wider question. Have you got a favourite subgenre, or is that too wide a question?
No, it's not too wide. It's not too wide a question. The answer is no. I am a crime fiction omnivore, is the best way to put it. I'm not vegetarian. I'm not a carnivore. I'll eat anything if it's good, kind of thing. And I probably have some preferences. There are things that I read more of than others, but I will. I read the dark serial killer stuff, but I'll still try some cozies. I read stuff that's a bit humorous. I read historical stuff. I still read some young adult stuff now and again. I read a lot of police procedurals. I do have a fondness for small town crime. An American, I think it's called, Southern Gothic and Grit Lit and things like that. So your likes of Attica Locke setting it in small town Texas, but also James Lee Burke. I love James Lee Burke. James Lee Burke's amazing. Kind of lyrical writing about a strong sense of place, but entwining the crime in it, which I guess goes back to what we talked about, the Australian and New Zealand sense of being close to nature, even if you're not in it. And the American South kind of has that in a different way, but similar. And also that frontier vibe. New Zealand and Australia were very much the far frontier of the British Empire. The British Empire sprawled over a massive part of the world, and we were the far edge of it, the down by Antarctica, down the furthest away on the opposite side of the world edge. So that kind of frontier spirit that you also get in the American West, and a little bit in a different way, and with the links to the land in the American South, and the sparse populations and the mountains and the hills and the lakes and stuff. So I love, John Hart and James Lee Burke. Karen Salvalaggio, who's a kind of London-based American author, has a really cool series set in Montana. Christine Carbo has a good series set in Montana, Attica Locke in Texas. John Hart's marvelous. David Joy, Tom Bowman. I'm missing some really obvious ones. Wiley Cash. So that's kind of that grit lit Southern Gothic stuff. So I do like a lot of that, but I read way more other things like serial killers and police procedurals. Love Michael Connolly, love Val McDermid, Ian Rankin, Mark Billingham. A couple of British. I know I'm talking about Australia, New Zealand, but a couple of British recommendations just throwing out there. You need to read Eva Dolan. She's fantastic. You need to read Claire McGowan. Books set in Northern Ireland on the Northern Ireland and Irish border. They're brilliant. Steve Kavanagh is fantastic, kind of legal thrillers. I love legal thrillers as an ex-lawyer kind of thing as well. So I'll read anything if it's good, Alex. And if I find an author I like, I'll read more of them and try and read more like them. But I'm also always looking for new authors to try. So,
is there anybody that you've not interviewed that you'd love to interview?
Anyone I've not interviewed that I'd love to interview?
Yeah.
That's an excellent question, Alex. I assume we're talking living, not living or dead kind of thing.
Living, yeah.
Living. Who would be excellent to interview? I would love to interview James Lee Burke in person. I've had 2 outstanding phone interviews with him. He doesn't travel. He lives in Louisiana and Montana in America, and he doesn't do overseas travel, which is why we've never, unfortunately, had him over here for Thick Snow Peculiar or the Diamond Dagger or anything like that. And as much as he loves trout fishing and outdoors, he won't come to New Zealand because he doesn't kind of do overseas travel, which is a shame. I've had some amazing conversations with him, so I would love to interview him in person. I actually was near where he lived in the States a few years ago, and I probably should have gone and kind of hung out with him, but I didn't, which I regret. So I'd love to interview him in person. But in terms of someone that I've never interviewed, I've met Sarah Paretsky, who's amazing, and I met her at BoucherCon in Toronto. And I think I might have met her at a British Crime Festival when she was over here a few years ago as well. But I've had like a brief conversation with her, like, a 2-minute conversation. So I would love to do an in-depth, proper interview with her because she, along with Val McDermid, I think is kind of, if you were going to choose a modern day living Queens of Crime. So we've got the Golden Age Queens of Crime, Ngaio Marsh, Agatha Christie, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy Sayers. And you could kind of throw Josephine Tay from Scotland in there as kind of a 5th one as well. But there were those 4. So if you were going to choose a modern day living Queens of Crime, and you would have thought of people like Petey James and Ruth Rendell before they sadly passed away, and Sue Grafton in America before she sadly passed away. But now that they have, for me, I think you write down Val McDermid and Sarah Paretsky in indelible ink and then you have a debate about who the other two are, because there's lots of other amazing female crime writers who have been groundbreaking and led the way and done different things, whether they've done it over 30 books or done it over 5 books, like Gillian Flynn, kind of thing, or less. And so, but for me, it's Val McDermott and Sarah Paretsky, Queens of Crime, and let's debate who the other two are. And that might be a fun debate for the UK Crime Book Club. So I would love to have a proper sit-down, hour-plus long interview with Sarah Paretsky. I think that would be really cool.
Have we got any more audience questions out there? Yeah.
Let me see. Are there good historical crime fiction writers in New Zealand? Yes, there are some. I mean, in a way, Money in the Morgue is historical crime fiction because it's set back in the 1940s. It's set during the Second World War with Inspector Allen kind of traveling to New Zealand, which is what he did in the New Zealand set books, which Nia Marsh actually wrote during the war. So she was writing books during the war, not knowing how the war would end, that was actually incorporating what was happening. So that's really fascinating. If you read like Dyed in the Wool, Stella was kind of looking back kind of 80 years in the past when she was writing the book. But outside of that, there's plenty of others too. In fact, there's a section in Southern Cross Crime on historical Australian and New Zealand mysteries. So I included a separate historical section. I didn't just do contemporary stuff like Barry does. Barry did a whole separate book on historical noir, which is fantastic. So he hasn't included historicals in his British and American and Nordic and European books, where I've included a whole section. So just off the top of my head, and ones again that you can kind of more easily get here in the UK. There's a book called This Mortal Boy by Fiona Kidman, and it's published by Belgravia Books here, which is a London publisher, and it's a little bit like The Long Drop by Denise Miner, which came out 2 or 3 years ago and won the Scottish Crime Writing Prize, and also was shortlisted for a number of other awards. And that it's inspired by a true story, but it's a novel. It's not a true crime book. So it's inspired by a murder or a killing in New Zealand that happened back in kind of 1950s New Zealand. It's kind of post-war New Zealand, and all the kind of outcomes of us still having capital punishment at that time. We abolished it soon afterwards, and so it's inspired by that. But it is a novel. It's a novelization of that time and that case, and that won like every award in New Zealand. It won the literary award, the Ockham New Zealand Book Awards. It won the Nia Marsh Award. It's the first ever book to win both those two awards. It also won a historical writing prize because it's historical, and it also won a popular fiction prize. So it swept like 4 books, which no one's ever done before. And it is actually available over here in the UK. There's been some nice newspaper articles and reviews about it, but I don't think it's necessarily stacked 50 high in the bookstore. But if you ask your local bookstore, they'll be able to get it very easily if they don't actually have it on the shelf, because it is available just down the road. So you can get it at UK prices. This Mortal Boy by Fiona Kidman, who's actually a dame. She's Dame Fiona Kidman. It's her first crime novel, and she's written it kind of in her 70s. She has a 40-year career writing about the lives of women and some scandalous things back in the 60s and 70s. She had nicknames about her, and she's written kind of script writing and journalism, and she was made a dame for her services to literature. And then she's like, yeah, I'm going to write a crime novel. And it's a brilliant one. So that's well worth checking out, This Mortal Boy by Dame Fiona Kidman. There's some other really good ones. One called Red Herring, which I actually probably have sitting a little bit out of reach, by Jonathan Cullinane, and that's published by HarperCollins in New Zealand. I don't think it's as readily available here, but I think you can get the ebook here at a reasonable price in the UK and the US. On the top of my head, Jen Sheaf writes some other good books. I mean, The Quaker is historical fiction written by a New Zealand-based author who's a New Zealand citizen, Liam McElveny, but is set in Scotland. That won and was shortlisted with a number of awards. And there's a lot of really good Australian stuff too, which I include in Southern Cross Crime. But the question was about New Zealand. So definitely This Mortal Boy. What else would be easily to get over here? Definitely Money in the Morgue, definitely This Mortal Boy, and maybe check out Red Herring by Jonathan Cullinane, and The Gentleman's Club by Jen Sheaf as well, which is a kind of looking at, and they are very good at looking at New Zealand society in kind of the 40s, 50s, 60s kind of eras and stuff like that.
I think that's probably everything I can think of. Let's leave it there then. Thank you, Craig, for introducing us to your book.
Oh, well, someone's just bought Catching Crow. They said, so I hope you enjoy it. It's kind of crime mixed in with some other stuff, and it is YA, but I hope you really like it. It's a different voice and a different kind of story. So.
Thank you so much, Craig, for this.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's been an absolute pleasure. So.